My name is Gustavo Godoy, and I'm an artist. I live in Los Angeles, California. I grew up in Southern California. Half of my family comes from Mexico, and half of my family is kind of traditional American family. Half of them from Oklahoma, and the other half from Michigan area. As a kid, I spent a lot of time with my family, specifically with my dad, fixing the cars, building things around the house. As an early kid, I thought I would be an architect, maybe. My dad was an architect and an urban planner, and I spent a lot of time on construction sites with my dad, watching the earth movers move the landscape around, carrying dirt away and creating spaces for foundations of buildings. And then I would get the chance to see the cement trucks come in and pour the foundations of buildings. And then eventually the framers come in and build these amazing structures, and at that point I would kind of lose interest. That was the moment when the sheetrock went up and the stucco and plaster went up, and all of the inner workings of constructions kind of disappeared. Early on, I was a kind of child who took things apart and built things, whether it was the tape player that didn't work or my friend's bike that somehow wasn't functioning properly. I was the one who fixed everything, and that carried over into who I became as an artist. Originally, I thought of myself as a painter. After undergraduate, I began making paintings that really had a lot to do with objects, and so shortly thereafter, I realized I should be making sculpture. So I went back to school and studied architecture for a year, and learned a lot of things, but also learned that architecture is a very different experience than making art. There's a tradition and also a lot of practical things that make architecture very different from an art practice. In art, you're really expected to push boundaries, and in architecture, you have to work within very specific boundaries. About the time that my son turned 5, I was really thinking about what his experience was in growing up in Los Angeles. As a kid, I had the freedom to roam around fields and build tree houses and really kind of explore the neighborhood and the parks that were around me and mountainsides that dotted the landscape of where I grew up. My son was growing up in Los Angeles, and I wouldn't allow him to go off, a block away from my home. It was really a moment for me to look back and think about how different my life was from what my son was going, the way that he was going to grow up. So the first of these big constructions that I made had him in mind. There was an idea that I was building essentially a tree, not necessarily a tree house, but a tree for him to climb. And there was an idea that this was going to be his opportunity to climb out on a branch and test the limits and kind of explore and have that kind of organic experience that I had as a child. And it was important for me to find a place for him to explore. The way that I build these structures is a very loose, organic process. I literally start with 2 bits of wood, and the beginning place is that I challenge myself to find the most dynamic connection between those 2 bits of wood. So essentially, I give myself a system to work within. And I go to my saw, my mini saws, and I start cutting wood and putting things together, 1 or 2 pieces at a time. I mean, I don't plan things out, I don't make drawings, and I really just try to work kind of in the moment. Over time, the accumulation of all of those choices becomes a form. Because I do have a background in architecture, and I believe because of my Mexican heritage, we're a culture that builds and fixes a lot of things. So those 2 things, architecture and I would say my inherent problem-solving construction sensibility, those 2 things allow me to work pretty freely within this way of building. The style becomes something that looks very rough, but at the same time, I think looks designed and structural. I like the idea that the work appears to be teetering on, falling apart. It looks on the verge of destruction, but at the same time, it might look like it's on its way up, that it's in the process. There's a tension there that interests me. So the paint that I chose for the piece is a silver industrial paint. The idea is that it creates, in a way, its own light within the piece. The reflections add a light source that draws out or illuminates certain lines and planes within the space of the piece, rather than build as many lights as I might often in other pieces into the piece. I'm allowing the paint to do what the paint can do, which is reflect. And the silver paint works with the idea of the altar for me. The shine gives it a quality of importance, I think, that the same way that an altar would be gilded in gold leaf. There are ramps and steps that will lead the viewer up into the sculpture. I see those as an invitation and a way to immediately ask you to explore the piece. The perspective from within the piece drastically changes your perception of that object, but also of your art experience. A child that gets to enter a sculpture will have a very different view of what art can be than a child that is only allowed to stand back and look at paintings. So it's an important kind of moment, I think, that I'm trying to acknowledge for people, not necessarily just children, but adults as well. Over the last few years, I've built a couple of other large-scale interactive pieces that you could climb within, and I was given the opportunity to do this piece here in Jacksonville, and upon coming for my visit, I was really kind of taken by the space of the museum. The wide stairwell really lends itself to a project that I'm really interested in right now, which has to do with belief systems and the way that art becomes a belief system of its own. And the stairwell sort of reminding me of the entry to a cathedral or a church. There's a sort of ritual of going into what is essentially a sacred space. Art objects, I'm thinking of them right now in my practice in terms of being empty idols. They're idols that, without artists there to give them, to name them and give them meaning, essentially they're just objects, no different than every other everyday object that we encounter. So the museum, is kind of this perfect place to think about how religion, I guess, in a way, and people's belief systems parallels the way that we think about art, the way that we value art, and how artists try to make sense of the world around us. And I think religion does a lot of that. So this piece is called Empty Altar, Empty Throne, and takes on the idea of the altar being a place where some very sort of special thing happens, whether it's a Christian altar or a Jewish altar or a Hindu altar or a Mayan altar. It's in all of those cultures and religions, the altar becomes a place where something important happens. And in some cases that's sacrifice, and in some cases maybe it's just where you place something important. So to further engage the audience, I had the idea to build a throne into the piece. The throne is the seat of the priest, the king, the queen, captain of the ship, the judge. It's kind of this important position to be in. And so I was interested in how the audience could be empowered by that, by being put in that position. People need a way to engage art and feel that it's there for them. And specifically here in Jacksonville, I don't think it's always been known as an art center. And so how do you speak to an audience that maybe doesn't have a lot of access to art the way that someone growing up in New York does? I don't think it's speaking down to people. I think it's celebrating them and showing that we, as both artists and museum curators and the essential people of the museum and the art community, that we're thinking about you as an audience and that we want you to come and explore and engage in what is a worldly pursuit that we do, I think. So I made the piece specifically for the space, specifically for the people here, and I hope people will come and really explore it.